Howdy, folks. Do you see faces wherever you go? Yes? Well, then hold tight, because today's guest has written the book about exactly that, right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. Well, as always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and before we get into it, I've got one thing to ask of you. I've noticed that over 65% of our viewers on YouTube and listeners on audio are not actually subscribed to this channel. I mean, come on, people, you can really help me out by hitting that subscribe button. It'll help me get even more amazing guests on the show. It's just one click, that's all it takes. Should be easy. Just do it. Thank you so much. Now, without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, the commercial portrait photographer, photojournalist, and the author of the brand new book, Objects Are People Too. Give it up for Mr. Justin Sutcliffe. Justin, man, how's it going?
Kirsten, thank you so much for having me. It's great. Really, really very happy that you've sort of reached out.
Yeah, it's fantastic because, well, your book, Objects Are People Too, is actually, as far as photo books are concerned, it's a super fun read. Now, we'll get right into it because I'm pretty sure that our listeners and our viewers on YouTube as well will love this book. It's called Objects Are People Too. Give us a bit of a sort of a helicopter view on what this book is about.
So, there's this thing called facial pareidolia, and it's the psychological condition of seeing faces in everyday objects or things, basically. And I have it, and I think lots of people have it, actually. Many more people have it than we think. And in my case, it tends to involve sometimes fleeting things that just momentarily appear as faces and then sort of cease to be. And I first started noticing that I was sort of rearranging reality into faces in my own mind quite a few years ago now. And it was kind of quirky and funny. And then it started to become a thing that was happening the whole time. And that was actually surprisingly a problem if you're a photographer, and especially a portrait photographer. If you're seeing faces in things when you're trying to actually look at faces, or when you're, as a photojournalist, you're looking at it as a scene and little parts of it are rearranging in your mind as a face, it's a bit of a, it's a barrier to what you're trying to communicate. So
people do this pretty much automatically a lot of the time, because I remember there was a big thing years ago, or decades ago, the face on Mars. Do you remember this thing? Where
yes,
apparently, you know, there's a rock formation that looked like a human face on Mars. And it was basically because of shadows and all the rest of it, the way that the photo was taken, you know, from above. But of course, the press went nuts about like, oh, well, you know, this is like evidence of, you know, humans.
Evidence of intelligence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. The interesting thing about it is, and I haven't studied it enormously, I read around it a little bit, just kind of like, because as with anything, you wonder, is this just me? And then you very rapidly realize it's not. Lots of people have this condition, shall we say. And in those that have it, and in human beings generally, we very often recognize the face before we recognize the objects that are being sort of contributing to it. So we actually see the face before we realize it's, you know, a piece of bread. I mean, probably not with a piece of bread, but so there's an actual cognitive process that is different and is probably genetically advantageous for us in the fact that we see and recognize faces in our peer groups, in our hunting groups, you know, when we were primordial man, I don't know. But it's clearly something that is that has stayed with us. And I think I haven't necessarily researched it, but I found out just enough about it to sort of learn how I would go about filtering it out, because it became a bit of an impediment. And, you know, what was funny and quirky to begin with suddenly became like it was ruining. It was like a smell that you can't get rid of, or a taste you can't get rid of. It was just constantly present, and in a way that was really intruding on what I was trying to do as a photographer. So I went through a process of trying not to see them, and then every so often they would still surface. And instead of getting upset about it or sort of considering it some kind of trauma, I thought, well, I'll just photograph them. And then I used to carry a Polaroid 680, kind of pull it, and it would fold out, and I'd shoot little Polaroid pictures of it. And but Polaroid became eye-wateringly expensive, as probably people know, and so I sought another outlet. And a friend of mine, very good photographer called Abby Traylor Smith, told me about an app called Shake It, ironically, and that was one of the first apps, I think, that was licensed by Polaroid to have the official kind of stippled background, that kind of that iconic diamond stippled kind of surround. But also they'd done a really good job of kind of creating an algorithm of late 1990s 600 Polaroid film, and the way that it breaks in terms of the color breaks between the sort of the golden and turquoisey tones, and so essentially I started doing it on that. And to begin with, I was just using it as profile pictures for social media and things like that. And it was a bit of a joke. And then there was a point at which it kind of got its own gravity, and it seemed like I had a collection of photographs here. And so I started it as a project, and initially as a little blog, actually, that I'm sure very few people saw, only some of my friends, and not even all of them. And then it was suggested as an article in the Guardian, and they ran it, and I just got dozens and dozens and dozens of random emails from people I'd never met, who were showing me stuff in their food and their clouds, and I suddenly, it was like I had accidentally found a constituency, as it were, like people that also saw these faces. And of course, for them, it was something different because they weren't having to necessarily take photographs. And so for them, there was a pure joy to it. And I really love that. And from that, I thought, well, there is a project here, but it's kind of a weird project because this is something I'm essentially trying not to see. So I can't go out and actually build on the project. The project has to slowly, the water level kind of raises up with the amount of photographs that I had.
That's actually interesting because you're saying, like, initially you were trying to basically unsee these faces.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, and then eventually
it's completely a sort of counterintuitive to make a book of things that you were trying not to see.
Well, I mean, that in itself is interesting as far as a photo book is concerned, because it's usually when you think about making a photo book, it's about the things that you want to see and you want other people to see, but you're actively trying to avoid seeing the things that you eventually turn into a book.
Yeah, and I don't want it to be sort of thought of as this was some sort of trauma, because it wasn't traumatic, but it was really irritating to be trying to concentrate on something, and very often quite serious subjects that I was dealing with, and then just have something sort of distracting you. And in the introduction, I describe one particular occasion where the distraction could have turned out to be quite disastrous, and fortunately it didn't. So no great drama there, but it was a lesson in kind of keeping your boundaries as a photographer. And I think one of the things that appealed about this particular project to me was that because a lot of the work that I'd done professionally was quite serious and often with subject matter that had weight to it, shall we say. And so to do something that was entirely light, and filled with a certain amount of joy and frivolousness, and but then also not completely, because some of these places, you'll read the caption of where they are, and they're quite serious places, and they often happened on very serious days. Like I noticed as time went on that I would see these faces that would suddenly appear much more often when I was in a state of sort of strong emotional state, should we say. So I wouldn't say always stress, because sometimes it was happiness. But any time there were really strong emotions involved, I would see these faces, these imaginary faces, because let's face it, none of these things actually exist as faces. And I would see them far more frequently when I was in a heightened emotional state. And so sometimes they represent, very bad days, or moments when I'm sort of grappling with kind of quite emotionally challenging situations, and then suddenly these faces appear. So sometimes they're on my best days, and sometimes they're on my worst days, and sometimes they're just on every day. But definitely I would get a little run of them, like buses, like nothing for ages and half a dozen all at once. And I said this, and it's genuinely how it was.
That in itself was really quite interesting.
Months.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is super interesting. It's just the fact that, you're almost like your mental state triggers that ability. And what I love about the book is also that, practically each photo has a little description with it of where and what and under what circumstances it was taken, and it just gives you that little bit of of an extra insight into the meaning of that particular photo. And you mentioned a situation. I think I can't remember whether it was Afghanistan or Libya, I believe.
Libya. One particular one in Libya. Yeah, we were in a camp for migrants who had been caught or turned into the local militia, and they were being kept in truly terrible conditions. It just sort of very, very, very stressful to see the way that human beings are capable of treating other human beings. It was shocking, actually, and shocking in a way to somebody that had seen a lot of shocking things. And as we were inside, suddenly this face appeared to me, and I instantly switched, because I shoot everything on the phone. I instantly switched and picked my phone up and pointed it at this face that had appeared, and of course the guards in this camp were instantly extremely suspicious, because photography with phones is the sort of the realm of spying and all the things that aren't professional, and the fact that I had switched from a professional camera to a phone, and it really upset them. And I tried to explain what I was doing, and as I was saying it, it was sounding more and more ridiculous. And then as my fixer then interpreter interpreted it into Arabic, you could tell he thought it was ridiculous too. And the guy hearing it thought it was ridiculous. And there was this terrible moment where I was like, actually, yeah, that's this. When you say it out loud, it sounds terrible, really awful. So, and we just about negotiated our way through it without it being a problem, but it could very easily have become a problem. And I know photographers who have, for instance, got their cameras out in difficult situations to shoot something for social media, because it's just easier to post from the phone, and it's descended into sort of real hostility and problems for them. So I think I was lucky to avoid it, but it was a real reminder of the fact that these things can come to me at any moment, and sometimes I have to to apply a little bit of judgment as to whether or not I actually want to keep them or whether I just want to let them go past. And sometimes you just have to look at them and say, okay, that's a face, and then just let it go past. There was maybe at one point an obsessional nature of whenever they appeared, I had to capture them because that was part of like a parameter that I'd set myself. But I think after Libya, I was a little bit more sort of circumspect about whether or not it was a face or whether or not it appeared to me, but whether or not I was going to capture it.
And of course, in the book, I mean, one of the things that I think is quite staggering is just the sheer amount of images in the book. What's the time span?
So, I think the first of these images in the book is just after the conversion from Polaroid film to shooting it on digital. So I think it's probably around 2008 or so, 2008, maybe 2010. And like I say, I will get sometimes a dozen in a week and then nothing for like sort of a month or 2 months. It's kind of, it's a peculiar thing. But what's interesting is, the book is the smallest proportion of what I've actually got. There's many, many, many more. And we had to give up quite a few that I loved because there just wasn't space for them in the book. But there's not enough for there to be necessarily a second edition, but or at least there are plenty of photographs, but not enough that I really love enough to think that they're different enough, because you'll see in the book there are some subject matters that we've kind of grouped together where I seem to see them quite frequently in certain things. And so, there was a point where it was like, well, how many pictures of, I don't know, bread or whatever, do we honestly want to see? So sometimes they appear in certain things quite frequently and in other things infrequently. And I wanted the book to be fun, but not a joke. I wanted it to be quirky, but I also wanted the photography to be good photography. So I wanted it to be considered. And I wanted a little sense of the fact that when these faces appear to me, they have a personality for a fraction of a second. They're not just, oh, that looks like a face. I get the full resonance of whether or not that face looks angry or sad or happy or welcoming or hostile. There are a whole range of emotions that I get from the faces when I see them. So I wanted that to be in the book as well, because my practice as a portrait photographer, obviously expression is everything. And so the expression, for want of a better word, of these faces that don't exist was kind of really important to me.
When did you first realize that you could see faces in everyday objects?
The funniest thing is I can't put my mind onto an actual time. I think it might have been when I stopped doing primarily just photojournalism, just documentary photojournalism, and concentrated quite strongly on portraiture within photojournalism, so portraits for publications and that sort of thing. And so I suspect there's something in the subconscious that's constantly thinking about expressions and faces that seemed to express itself in the way that I was seeing these things. I'd always seen occasional quirky things. And then I also went to see a great exhibition in the Tate about the early years of abstract photography. And I realized that there was a canon in that early abstract photography. Weirdly enough, Guy Baudin, who's obviously much more famous for his incredible sort of photography and pictures that are sort of erotically charged. But he, like many artists of that era, he went through many phases, and he was an early proponent of abstract photography as well. And he had done a series of photographs that were essential facial pareidolia, things around Paris and other places that look like faces. And so I realized that unknowingly, I was just doing something which was part of, I wouldn't say an established canon of photography, but certainly I wasn't breaking any new ground. There were other books out there which tended to be lots of people who had contributed one or two photographs, of something that looked like a face. But because of the process of trying to filter them out, the process of trying not to see them, and if I choose not to have that process in place, I can see them literally everywhere, just everywhere. I joke that I can see 5 of them at any one time if I choose to, but it's true. That is the way that my mind is obviously arranging things for me. And so I'm glad that I've got that sort of filtering in place, but that means that I don't see the obvious ones. So I don't see like the ones that you often see in memes, and there's like a single subject matter. That very rarely occurs to me, luckily for me. So the things I see tend to be sort of random collisions in time and space of things that have just sort of come together, sometimes very fleetingly, sometimes just fleetingly in my experience. So, I mean, hilariously, there's one photograph in the book of an arrangement of ornaments on a side table that had probably been moved around and rotated, as you dust and clean and whatever. But I'd never seen them as a face. And then I saw them as a face one day, and then I never saw them as a face ever again, even though their orientation probably stayed the same, or similar. And so I was aware of the fact that it wasn't just like I had some special gift. It was that these things would only happen at certain times and depend on how I was feeling as well.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platyball tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. What is really striking about the imagery in the book is that they're really, they're plainly obvious. It's not, you don't really, there's no degree of interpretation, I think, necessary. You look at the images, you go, well, that's quite obviously a face, And it's one of those things that I think when, all of a sudden, when you start thinking about it, you start potentially seeing those things, around you as well. It's just that you've never really paid any attention to it.
I think that is certainly true. The publishers contacted me when we'd first sort of spoken about it, and I'd sent them the proposal. The publishers then started sending me their pictures of things that they suddenly started seeing. So once you kind of get into that rhythm of looking at it, you do start to see them, I think. I hope that I am not sort of spreading some kind of illness. Some communicable psychic disease of seeing faces and everything, because it's funny if you see them occasionally. It's not so much if everything you look at kind of rearranges into a face,
But of course, putting them together in a collection or a book, it's almost like closure in a sense. Now it's not a weird thing anymore. Now it's actually something that's a bore fruit and turned into something tangible, like a book.
Yeah, and that process was actually, it was lovely in the fact that it was with a publisher that I didn't know, and I had approached a couple of publishers and had people sort of say that they were interested in the idea, and then out of the blue, I got a call from Unicorn saying, actually asking me whether I would be interested in producing a sort of a more retrospective work. And I said, well, that would be absolutely fantastic. But in the meantime, I have this kind of ready to go almost. You know, I've culled it down to 200 pictures, and I've got a sense of what I think its shape is. And they were like, well, okay, not at all what we were thinking of, and they were really on board with it straight away, and they kind of got it. And the designer, Felicity, who worked on the sort of the layout of the book, she just kind of got what I wanted from it and had been thinking about at the time that I was sort of making it. And the process of then putting it together happened remarkably quickly. It wasn't there wasn't a great deal of sort of wrenching of hands and sort of wringing of hands, I should say, and sort of thinking a lot about how each page would go. I think Felicity really understood what I wanted, did a beautiful version of the layout, and I think we made about 3 changes, and those changes were either that we thought that colors maybe would work better. And sometimes, weirdly enough, that whole sort of publication thing of having faces facing in towards the margin, you know, in towards the crease. And so sometimes I was like, well, maybe we should swap those two around, because this one looks like it's looking outwards this way, and this one's going the other way, and maybe they should be looking into the middle. And, you know, there were those kind of discussions, but we didn't have any sort of wholesale, like, okay, change that page or anything. So it came together really quickly, which I think was merciful for me, because that time spent looking at the photographs over the sort of the weeks, months of putting the book together definitely led to an increase in my frequency of seeing faces, to the point where, in fact, when we decided that we would put another 2 pages in, those 2 pages are pictures shot since beginning the collection of the photographs and publishing. So they're really recent.
Okay.
So there's 2 in there that were shot sort of while we were putting the book together. And I noticed that I was seeing a lot at that point. So there's certainly something to be said for the fact that when you're in it and thinking about it, you definitely see them more often as well.
What's the process like of putting a book together like this? I mean, how do you get from, I think this is a really good idea to turn this into a book, to then getting a publisher on board to finalize a project like that?
It's an interesting question, actually, Kirsten. It's one of those things that I had done 2 books before, both of which were children's books, and I'd been hired as essentially the illustrator, the photographic illustrator for those 2 children's books, and which in itself was kind of sort of just a little bit of luck. You know somebody who knows somebody who's looking for a photographer because they're doing a children's book, and they're an established children's author in this case, very well-established children's author in America called Stephanie Kalmanson. And she was looking to do a book about dogs, and it wanted to be photographs rather than illustrations, and a bit of luck, to be honest. This one was completely different in the fact that when I knew that I wanted it to be a book as opposed to anything else, I then went and looked at publishers that might be suitable and what the means and the look of the publishing would be. So it was important to me that it wasn't too lightweight or too glossy. I didn't want to produce a bathroom book. The subject matter is in itself light-hearted, but I don't want it to be ridiculous. So I had looked at a couple of publishers that might be suitable, and some of them were from probably the more arts end, sort of very lightly bound. And obviously that route was going to involve fully funding myself, and probably then doing all of the kind of getting it distributed as well, or most of it. And then there was another sort of I'm reluctant to talk about names of publishers, because there are people that either didn't respond or actually nobody passed on the book, but a couple of people who had shown interest then didn't sort of pick up on the interest when I kind of redoubled my efforts. And those people were publishers which I felt it would sit well within their canon, in the fact that they had books that were, I thought, to be of similar sort of weight, in terms of they had some very, very, very serious books, but then they also had some kind of nicely light books, books that were sort of interest, but not necessarily earnest, should we say. Not that I'm against earnestness in any sense, but it was not appropriate to this particular project. And so I went to Photo London a couple of times, and went and spoke to publishers and sort of asked them whether they were interested in it. And it was just coming back from Photo London last year that I got a call from Unicorn as to whether or not I might like to produce a book of my other photography. And so it was, once again, it's kind of good luck more than anything else. I wish that it was a repeatable process that I could kind of advise people to do. But I would say that depending on what you have, picking a publisher that's right for the subject matter is really, really, really important. So, you know, at the top end, there were some quite big names who would have wanted to, who probably would have produced it in a way that was glossier, perhaps, and was aimed to be sold at very high volumes, high-ish volumes, should we say? Very high volumes is probably a hyperbolic term, because it's not going to be very high volumes, but higher volumes certainly than this. And in the end, what was great about Unicorn were small, dedicated, passionate about books. You know, I went to their offices in Sussex, and it smelt of lignin, you know, it smelt of books. You walked in the front door and you just thought, okay, they really love books. And there were books everywhere. And everybody that I spoke to was passionate about what they produced. And what I think was interesting from my point of view was they had done many books with artists and about art, and they had done a few books with photographers about photographs. But all of those books had tended to be sort of with a degree of seriousness and looking over the body of work of a photographer perhaps throughout their whole career. And so this was something of a departure in the fact that this is just a tiny, tiny little slice of what I've done and do, and it represents a real divergence from the majority of what I do, you know. And as such, I wanted it to have a certain feel of being fun, enjoyable, but not silly, you know. And I wanted it to be able to sit quite happily in a design shop, or in a bookshop, or in the book department of a gallery. And I wanted it to feel like it could be at home in those places. And so a lot of the things that perhaps were their traditional and very well researched reasons for how they might like to lay out the title, I was trying to point it in another direction, so that, you know, a lot of the things like having the title really high up above the picture, I actually wanted it to be smaller and lower, because I wanted the picture to be the thing that drew you in, because the title only means something to me, I think. And that process was really nice and collaborative. They were really good. They came up with great options for covers and colors, and Felicity understood what I wanted from the text in terms of the fact that I wanted a font that was contemporary, but not no gimmicks, but also not a classic contemporary font, of which there are lots that I love. I wanted something that was a little different, and she instantly found it. Like the first thing she showed me, I was like, "Oh my God, she just completely gets the whole project." So yeah, it was one of those kind of happy convergence of two thoughts about something.
I think that's super important, is to find somebody who you can collaboratively work with, who really understands the basis of the whole project and the tone in particular. You find it in the music industry a lot. For history in music, and it's similar when you write material and you're trying to find a record company, for example. A major label would basically take that record and do whatever they want to do with it, because the drivers are different ones. It's sales and and publicity and the rest of it. A smaller label, like an independent label, would actually maybe be a lot more open to the artist's interpretation of that, if that makes any sense. So I think there's a lot of parallels.
It's a great parallel, actually, and that's what I liked was everything with them was a conversation. They brought their experience and their advice, but there was no dogma. There were certain things that they would strongly advise me against, and certain things that they would gently advise me against. And it was really good. And I hope that I listened enough, because this is a first venture into something that I've never done before. So I've obviously published two books, or been involved in the publishing of two books, I should say, and I've contributed to other books of many photographers who have contributed, so on subject matters as opposed to myself as an author. And so the idea of doing everything myself was both liberating and also sort of had to be taken seriously. And it took me weeks, and literally weeks. I like to think that I'm reasonably okay at writing by the standards of photographers, which is, not necessarily the highest bar, but it took me weeks. And each time I thought I'd got it, I read it and it just didn't sound like me, and I couldn't. They were very, very good at advising me that I wasn't trying to impress this sort of person or that sort of person, that I was really just trying to explain what this project was to me and how it came about. And they were very patient as well, which is great, because that was required. It took a while, but then when it finally sort of came, I sort of broke it all apart and kept the tiny little sentences that I'd liked in the various different versions that I'd written, and finally it came together, and I was able to explain what it was that I liked about the process. That was entirely collaborative with them, in a way that it wouldn't have been probably with a sort of a publisher that had a different vision for the book. So they were really patient and incredibly nurturing. They gave me nice soft boundaries, but they didn't sort of make it difficult or stressful for me to do it. And it all came together at exactly the right time. We didn't miss any deadlines, and off it went. And I was, I don't know, you've probably read the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, I wanted it to be personal. I wanted it to be a reflection of the process, which was occasionally funny, occasionally quite serious. A process of Artistic rigor, the A word. I think photographers always have to be very careful when they start talking about artistic rigor if they're like me from a practice of observational photography as opposed to blank page creation, which, if we're going to divide photography into two schools, which why we would divide it at all is probably beyond me, but broadly speaking, photography is either creative, where you're creating something from scratch, or broadly it's observational, in which case you're applying the way that you see the world to what you're seeing and the patience and kind of anticipation required to do that. Now, I've grown up and come up through the observational practice. And so when you start talking about art within observational practice, you always have to be very careful. There are many photographers who do this beautifully, but there are many who talk about it who it's probably more that they're extremely skilled and very strong vision in their observation, but it's not the same as artistic practice. But this, I'd set myself parameters, and I'd learned from other photographers, whether they be photojournalists or art photographers or documentarians. And I'd learned that the value of giving yourself boundaries so that the project doesn't sprawl off in various different directions, and you don't start working on multiple different media and with lots of different things, and then it all becomes incredibly experimental, which is useful, but not necessarily it doesn't have the sort of clear voice. And it was looking for a voice in something which, like I say, was essentially a group of pictures that I was trying not to see in the first place.
Yeah, but I think clarity is really a byproduct of boundaries very often. And this we've talked about this many times on this podcast. About how setting yourself limitations or boundaries is actually a very useful thing in order to in order to grow your own creativity. People often think like, oh well, in order to be creative, everything goes. There's no rules, and it's all open to anything. But I think the reality is that if you want to grow your creative brain or your creative ability, actually setting yourself limitations is super important. We talked about this on this podcast in connection with street photography, for example. Where you go out and you just limit yourself, by taking one particular lens, maybe even a lens that's not a typical street photography lens, a super wide 14 millimeter mega wide lens. And you just see, well, that is all I'm going to use, and I'm only going to shoot black and white, and I'm only going to shoot, I don't know, in the shadow or something, whatever. It's like whatever the limitation might be, but it forces you to think differently, and it forces you to think outside of the box. And then those limitations will then lead to you growing your ability as a photographer, in the future. And all of that will come in handy next time you're doing something else, because you start to see the world differently. I think setting yourself boundaries is usually a good thing.
I think so, and I couldn't agree more. From a photojournalist point of view, James Nachtwey, famously for years and years and years, would just get up and he would pick two bodies and two lenses, generally two prime lenses, but sometimes occasionally a zoom and a prime. And that would be what he would take, and he would take the amount of film that he wanted to shoot that day. And he already had an idea of the narrative and what he was imagining, even though he had no idea what was actually going to happen. But he knew what he was what the aspect of the story that he was trying to tell that day, what he was going to sort of focus on, and that rigor forces you to see things in a certain way, which is really interesting. Bruno Stevens also. So I remember having a long chat with him about how he would frequently take a piece of equipment that would be for the long-term project of whatever he was doing. So, for instance, everything that he shot in the West Bank and And in that sort of arena at the time, he was just shooting only black and white and only on square format. And that was that. He didn't, unless he was sent there on a magazine assignment to shoot color, basically he was extremely resistant to anything that was outside of that. And so each project and each body of work had an inbuilt boundary to it, that he worked, that everything worked within that boundary, and that limitation became your strength. And in very small ways, in my own sense, probably the only picture I've ever taken that I can guarantee most people have seen was taken from the fact that I was going into Russia, and I didn't have a visa to be there as a professional photographer, and it was all very, very, very last minute. Had a visitor's visa, and so I could take no long lenses. I could only take really sort of fairly sort of short lenses, and that ended up being my superpower. The fact that I couldn't get back from things meant that I had to get close to everything, and that created an image that was intimate and lasting that maybe I wouldn't have had to find if I'd had the luxury of staying back from this big news event. And so I, even in just like tiny little examples, which I know don't really lead out, but I completely agree in the fact that limitations give you strength. It's really funny. The street photography thing is also one of those things where street photography, you're going out looking for photographs in a way. I have a little compact camera that I take with me that has a zoom lens on it. And a lot of my friends who do street photography are slightly, should we say, skeptical of the idea of having a street photography camera with a zoom lens on it.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you're not really making a choice. And then I explain to them that what I'm using it for is as to take personal pictures in professional assignments where I don't have the ability to move from where I am to where I want to be with a fixed focal lens. I'm right here. I can't move because I'm doing something else, but I can pull out a camera, reframe it the way I want, and shoot it. And they sort of give me a pass on that. But I think even that, those limitations, that limitation of a small compact camera is a useful limitation, as opposed to thinking, well, I'll actually shoot that photograph on the professional cameras that I'm working on. Just having something that separates it so that it's a separate process in your own practice, I think is really useful.
And sometimes you can take these conventions. I mean, if we stick with street photography, for example, the vast majority of people will say like, oh, well, it's a 35 or a 50 mil lens, there'd be like your standard recipe, maybe an 85, something like that, but you can actually just
everyone loves 28, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but you're within that sort of, that's your sort of general kind of spectrum of lenses that you would ordinarily find in street photography. But of course, you can turn things around and basically say, like, oh, I'm going to take a 14 out there, or I'm going to take a 400. I'm going to do street photography with a 400 millimeter lens. Let's see what I can come up with that. And it might not, the first time around, it might necessarily, well, it might fail, but that's also part of the learning process,
I mean, Nick Turpin, do you know Nick Turpin's book about the people on the buses? And
yes, I've heard of it.
It's shot with a lot of what he did is with longer lenses, and Philippe Lorca de Courchia, of course, the famous and much contested Heads book was shot with incredibly long lenses, even though it's essentially sort of very, very, very artistically advanced street photography. I know what you mean in the fact that there are tropes that people kind of constantly follow, but actually, once again, giving yourself a different limitation.
Yeah, absolutely.
To a really interesting result.
Yeah, I mean, I remember actually, was this? I can't remember whether it was before the pandemic, or maybe it was just as the pandemic was coming to an end. I went into London and I literally took a 14 to 24 lens with me, which I basically set to 14 mil, super wide. And I thought, well, I'm going to spend a day in London. I'm going to take one body, that one lens, and I'm just going to, I don't know, do some street photography with that. I ended up going to the, what was it? It wasn't the British Museum. It was the Natural History Museum. And I managed to get some amazing shots in there just without 14 mil focal length. It was really incredible. I managed to get amazing shots down in the tunnels of the underground, in central London itself, at the Natural History Museum. They're very different shots from what I would have ordinarily gotten had I just taken, a 35 mil or a 50 mil lens, so something more standard. And it was really, it's one of these moments where I was thinking like, well, actually, you could do things if you start thinking slightly outside the box, you can actually get results that are very different from the norm because anybody can shoot street photography with a 35. That's my opinion. Maybe not.
I mean, I think I'm going to sidestep that particular landmine, but what I would definitely agree with is the idea that when you use something that abstracts your normal vision, that changes it for you, it's like visiting a foreign country. Suddenly everything looks new. You're not used to seeing it this way. You're not used to seeing things in this manner. And it fires different bits of your, of what appeals to you suddenly. You start seeing things in different ways. And I think it's an essential part of practices. On the one hand, we have this struggle as professional photographers, certainly, of consistency is the enemy of creativity.
Yes.
But
I know exactly what you mean, yeah.
But inconsistency is the enemy of a professional practice. So, where you draw that line and, where you allow yourself to wander off for an afternoon of trying things out and a day of trying things out and trying on clothes and see if they look good on you, and sometimes they don't. And so sometimes I will pick up a lens and spend a couple of days sort of shooting with a new lens and a length that I don't normally work with. And it's really interesting because frequently you can look at it and think, wow, this is actually pretty good. And it's only after a while that you realize that you're actually, it's like you're doing somebody's accent. And it's not authentically how you see things. But then there are some things where, like you're saying with the 14, where you obviously saw and felt that it was authentic because it was a new way of looking, but not a false way of looking.
And I think a different way of looking at.
Yeah, and that process of experimentation can only be done really practically. You can only try it and find out whether it works for you. There's like an old joke about how nobody knows how to fly a helicopter. You just sit in it and you do stuff, and then you see what happens. And then the next time you wanted to do it, that's what you that's what you do, which is like a fixed wing pilot's kind of joke about helicopter flying. But I think that's certainly true of photography. Is you do it and you see whether you like it, and then if you like it, then you develop it and you work along that line, and you know how you want to approach it in the future, whether that be with something as basic and straightforward as the equipment you're using or lighting styles. I know a lot of photographers are very careful about not sharing details of their lighting, but I all the people that I like the most, they share these details knowing that whatever they share is never going to be perfectly copied and replicated, and it's not really a challenge to the way that they see things because it will always be filtered through another way of seeing, another way of doing. So that, sharing these details just empowers other people to say, okay, well, that's interesting. Does this work for me? And if you as a photographer want to copy other people's work and want to have your work look like another photographer's work, then that's unlikely to be a particularly successful strategy, to be a professional photographer at any rate. and so it becomes self-sorting in any case, you know.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And, I mean, copying is a beautiful way of learning. That's the thing. It's where, as humans, we learn by copying others. And that's true in any art form, whether that's music. Music's always a good example. It's always a great, parallel. If you want to learn how to play guitar solos, you are going to copy other people's guitar solos to start with, and depending on which other guitarists you throw into the pot, eventually over time, your own personal style will be a direct result of all the ingredients that you've thrown into the pot over the course of decades, and that's, that is in music. That's a very well understood principle. It's also, I think, it's not too dissimilar in photography as well. It's a way of learning. It's a way of, seeing and being able to analyze other photographers' work. It's this thing when I think anybody who starts out with studio photography and studio lighting in particular, once you get to the point where all of a sudden you can read other studio portraits, you can read the light, you start to understand what the direction of light was, what the modifier was, how many lights there are in the picture. You start to see another dimension to that world. And that's what I love about, changing aspects of my own photography and setting these boundaries and limitations, because all of a sudden you sort of discover a new reality in a sense. Taking the 14 millimeter lens as an example, the world just looks different through a 14 millimeter lens. It's like macro photography. I think for me, being one of these people who got to macro photography really, really, really late, like not something I was ever interested in really very much at all. But then through a number of circumstances, I got to the point where, I was forced to do it. I actually love doing it. But it's one of these things, you start getting into that well, and you realize, wow, there's a world beyond the visible world, and it's super interesting. Photographing very small things. All of a sudden you see reality, from a perspective that you just haven't been able to see before, and it's extremely fascinating. That's very different from. I mean, actually, it's not very different from a sort of photojournalistic approach where you're telling a story as it unfolds. It's just a different story, I think.
I think narrative is really important, both in single photographs and in series of photographs. And you're right, it's storytelling, and that storytelling might be in macro photography, it might be in aerial photography, it could be, it should always be in portrait photography. I think there should always be a narrative. And I think it's very important that narrative not be, I'm good at taking pictures. That's not a very interesting narrative.
Yeah.
If you met someone and they said, hi, I'm a photographer and I'm really good at taking photographs, you say, well, that's great. And they say, no, but I'm really great at taking photographs. And that's all they could say about their photography, then that's not really a conversation. The photographers that I admire are people who are great photographers, but whose narrative is about the subject matter and the life of that subject matter, whether that be animals, landscape, people, tiny little things.
Yeah.
When you're looking at it, you're getting the sense of a story behind it, and you're getting the sense of the passage of time before that photograph and the passage of time leading out of that photograph as well. And you might get that over a series of photographs, or you might get it from a single image that moment of abstracted time makes your mind think about what happened before and afterwards. And that's the kind of photography that I find really exciting. And obviously photojournalism is by its very nature sort of rooted in that, because you're telling the story, and the story is the reason why you're taking the photographs in any case is to convey the sense of what's going on, much more than the sense of how big your photo muscle is. You're not really sort of trying to flex that, or at least I don't think you should be. And it then raises up sort of style and narrative. Where does your style fit into narrative, and how do you develop a style? Or is that just something that sort of comes to you over time, sort of organically? And I think it's my own experience of it would be that the more organic it is, the more authentic it tends to be, and authenticity is, I think, an increasingly important part of photographer's practice.
I was going to ask you this as a photojournalist: is there a danger of sort of style over content?
Definitely. No, there is definitely a danger of style over content, and we've seen it. So there are certain photographers who have taken very unusual images, and they've been absolutely authentic, but then their content and compositional approach has then been copied or aped by other photographers, and the words don't sound the same out of their mouth because it didn't come to them naturally. They're influenced by this other thing, and so what they produce are fine pictures, beautiful pictures, but they don't ring true, and they don't carry emotional sort of resonance. And so, in as much as I think it's important to develop a style at all, I think that style is think about what it is you want to say and what it is that you think that you want to say that is uniquely a reflection of the way you see the world. And not to necessarily imagine that that is special, but to imagine that the delineation of the way that you see the world next to somebody else's view of the world is an important part of what you're trying to communicate, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of political viewpoints, but I mean in terms of your visual viewpoint, how you like to see the world, how you like to arrange things in your photographs. I remember a sort of close friend of mine is a fantastic Dutch photographer called Geert van Kesteren, and he said, "Oh yes," he's looking at my pictures. He said, "It's good. You understand color. You use only two colors in your photographs." And up until then, I had no idea that I was doing that. It's just something that had, And he's like, "No, this is good. It's very successful color wise." And I had no idea that. And then, of course, as soon as he pointed it out to me, I was like, actually, all the ones I do really like are basically different tones and palettes within the same color group of two colors in each photograph, or two colors and neutrals, shall we say. And so there are some things which I think have to come organically, even if they are actually probably from well-traveled artistic practice that you just might not be aware of.
And of course, it always has to fit with the narrative. It's a little bit like in music, you always say like, well, whatever you play has to serve the song. Ultimately, you can play the greatest guitar solo in the world, but if it doesn't fit into the song, if it doesn't serve the song, then it's kind of pointless. And I feel like in photography, especially in photojournalism, when we're talking about style and narrative and and content, basically, then I think that, I don't know if you, as a photojournalist, I wonder whether you agree with me that the narrative or the content, in inverted commas, just because I can't think of a better word, it plays the superior role over style in that sense.
I couldn't agree more, to be quite honest. I think the biggest problem is when people try to shoehorn what they're seeing into an idea of how they think it should appear. And that's it's going to sound funny. I think good photography comes from a level of control. I think great photography comes from relinquishing that. So having the confidence in the basics, exposure, composition, timing, having the confidence that will sort of look after itself, and you're sort of hands off the wheel for a second.
Yeah,
and I think the greatest photographs show that kind of that surrender as opposed to the intention to kind of like hold it really tightly. And that, I think, speaks to the idea of not trying to make something be your style. Just kind of trust that the way that you're seeing it will be enough. You know, that if you have spent time and applied your own personal thought process to how you want photographs to look, if you practice that in the same way as if you exercise, this becomes something that will just happen, and you don't have to tightly, and then you can actually stray from what you might ordinarily think is the way that you see the world, and it will actually still come out as your voice. And you know, in a musical analogy, it would be like sort of hearing an entirely different genre of music made by a musician who pursues one genre, that they will still have that artistic interpretation and voice throughout, even if it's not actually conscious ones. Because if you try and make things stylistically, if you say, right, I want to shoot like Paolo Pellegrini, he has a particular look, and you could learn how to do that. You could then apply that to certain to a subject matter. Will it have truth? Well, if your starting off point is you're trying to do things around a technique, around a way of producing photographs, then that's never going to really be a true way of seeing it. That's true for Paolo Pellegrini, because this is the way that he now sees and expresses himself in the world through a process of organic, experimentation. But if you take his finished article and say, oh yeah, I want it to be like that, I think that's always going to not serve the story and not serve your experience of truth. And truth is a difficult thing, because 4 people will see the same thing 10 different ways. But if you are starting off from a position that is intentionally not authentic to you, your chances of producing anything really worthwhile diminish rapidly. And I think the only way of, the photojournalists that work the very best, and I'm not just talking about the historically big beasts, but all of the emerging wonderful photojournalism that's coming out, is all coming from people who I think early on figure out how to let go of the control and trust an instinctual and narrative voice of like, where is the story going, as opposed to I'm going to try and force it in this direction.
Yeah, again, there are many parallels to other creative fields. Again, music being one of them. It's music and photography have a lot in common in the sense that it's both, it's both a technical and a creative pursuit. So, the creative pursuit is obviously, the creative part is, we want to come up with something that didn't exist before. We want to make something out of thin air, whether that's writing a piece of music or creating a photograph, or making a video, whatever it may be, painting a picture. The technical part is we're going to have to gain some technical command over an instrument. Well, we're going to have to learn how to play an instrument like the guitar or something first before we can actually realize that. And of course, the problem is that then a lot of the time people focus too much on the technical side of it. And at the beginning, that's necessary because we're going to have to learn how to play that instrument in the same way that we have to learn what exposure actually is and how it works and how we can, create an image that's not completely over or underexposed. That part is necessary. But there is a point where you just have to let go of the technical side of it, and it becomes just part of your ability to express, either in terms of music, what you're hearing in your head, or in terms of photography, the story that you're trying to tell. The best piece of advice I was given ever at music college was one of my teachers said, like, I can't remember, I was struggling with learning a particular scale or something, and he was like, well, you're just going to have to learn all these scales, and the trick is, once you've learned them all and you spent the whatever it is 10,000 hours, learning all these skills. The trick is to then forget them all and just play. And I didn't really understand that when I was 16 or something, Later on, that became very obvious because it is absolutely true. When you're in the flow of it and you're playing, you don't think about scales and you don't think about the technical aspects. You just do. You just let flow and play. And many times when I remember either students or or people in the audience will come up and say like, "Oh, what scale did you play in this solo?" And I have absolutely zero idea. I really don't know. No idea. I just know I started somewhere. I had a particular feeling, and I ended, I don't know, 16 or maybe 116 bars later. Who knows? That stuff happens. But it's very similar with photography, I guess. Where you gain command over the tool, but then your creative mind or your creative eye just basically takes over, and you just do, essentially.
I think so, and I think there's another sort of I find that a really interesting analogy with the music, and I think we could also maybe think about it in linguistic terms, in the fact that a lot of the techniques that we learn as photographers are vocabulary, and learning the meaning of a certain word and when it is correctly used in a sentence, and learning the meaning of hundreds and thousands of words will make you the most excellent dictionary compiler, but it will not necessarily make you a poet. And
exactly.
So learning the word and what it means is very different to learning how you want to use that word to express the world you see around you. And in the same way that you're talking about the scales, forgetting them and then just allowing yourself to be, I think photography, and it comes back to this whole thing of relinquishing, is there's a point at which you just got to trust what I refer to as road under the bonnet.
Yeah.
Exactly. You've just got to trust that you've done enough of this that you don't actually have to think about what you're doing with your fingers and how you're setting it up. That, all of that will be sort of taken care of in the background with your mental processing. And then you're just concentrating on how do I feel? And for me, atmosphere is always really hugely important. So atmosphere over moment every single time. And that sounds like a terrible thing to say, but if we think of a Venn diagram, for want of a better word, of like the set of photographs taken that are dependent on an absolutely perfect moment, that either side of that moment, the photograph would be radically different in a way that would change the way it looks. And then the set of photographs where they're not changing very much over time, and really what appears as the importance of the photograph is something about the atmosphere. It's something about that feeling that you get. Now, there's an intersection, and there's lots of photographers that live in that intersection of the perfect moment and the atmosphere surrounding that perfect moment. But if I had to pick one set myself of what really moves me, it tends to be from the atmospheric set much more than the moment set. And that's obviously a huge simplification. I wouldn't want to in any way denigrate those, great sports photography and many things which are really dependent upon a set of actions which would be radically different within a fraction of a second either side of when the photograph is taken. But the photographs that stay with me tend to be the ones where I think there's a kind of a stretchy time, there's a moment that is sort of, it's not a fraction of a second. It might be several seconds or a second or a minute, and obviously the exposure is not, or is very rarely, that minute. The exposure tends to be just a little slice of that, but actually there's nothing appreciably different if you were to move the slider along in that minute. And I think those images are the ones that we work out that passage of time coming into and going out of in a different way, and they stay with us because of it. And so getting back to your point of like style over substance, story over everything. What's the story? What is what actually happened here, because that's the thing I think that we as human beings find interesting, more than necessarily perfection, which I don't think is to be striven for, to be honest. I don't think that perfection is a useful thing to strive for. I've been to many photographic societies and clubs where literally everyone in the whole room can shoot circles around me. They all have technical skills I could not dream of. I literally couldn't dream of. And they have the most beautifully, perfectly focused and timed shots of things. And they wonder why they don't have weight. And it's because the pursuit of that was to get that moment and that perfection, as opposed to tell the story of what's actually in the photograph.
Yeah.
And so sometimes not having the greatest, most eloquent vocabulary is a massive advantage. You know, Hemingway was a great writer. He did not use long words. There are lots of writers who used incredibly long words. So it's a clumsy comparison. But all I can say is that going back to that whole thing of whatever your limitation is probably also your superpower.
Absolutely.
If you're not good at something, avoid it. My first ever portfolio review, when I was heading off to New York at the tender age of 22 years old, to go off and kind of set up my first go at being on my own. And I went to see veteran and much revered, longest serving picture editor on Fleet Street, Ray Wells. And he flicked through my portfolio in this sort of slightly taciturn way, and indecently fast turning of the pages of what I had spent like weeks trying to rend from my very slender archive at the age of 22. And he said, "Yeah, no, really good." And I said, "Seriously?" And he said, "What, you want it seriously?" I was like, "Please." And he said, "Okay." And then he went through each picture and he gave me the breakdown. Mm. And at the end, I was a young news photographer, and the accepted practice was that your portfolio should be filled with spot news, news that you couldn't plan for, general news, news which you could plan for, features, long an assignment where you photograph several good pictures from a sort of a feature assignment to tell a story, and some famous people, and a bit of sport, to show that you could do sport, because that's what most news photographers were going to have to do on a day-to-day basis, was a bit of each. And he said, these pictures of football, what are they doing in here? And I was like, well, sport. And he said, don't show me what you can't do. I was like, okay. And I started making excuses like, oh, but I only had 10 minutes of the game, and then I had to go off and dev the film. And it was like, none of that matters. This is not what you're any good at. Okay. Don't show me this. These are 2 wasted pages. Take them out, or put something else in it. And or if you do sport, it's not football, that's for sure. So, find something else. And it was really great. It was great, very, very, very harsh advice, and fantastic. And it stayed with me. It's a thing that has been a little kind of like joke saying, like, don't show me what you can't do. It's, yeah. It's fantastic. But also the fact that I couldn't do sport really meant that anytime I was around sport, I was always looking for another narrative. If a magazine had, as somebody once hired me to photograph speed skiing, well, the speed skiing itself is the province of really good sports photographers. Certainly, nobody like me needs to turn up and think they're going to take a great picture of speed skiing. But the culture around speed skiing and the other little observations of the strangeness of the sport, those were things that I could see and had sensitivity towards. And so, once again, turn what you can't do into pointing you in the direction of what you can do. Strangely, this has a circularity in the fact that it comes back to the book.
Yes.
The app that I use to process the images into the digital Polaroids, as it were, it has a really specific set of breakpoints in terms of how much saturation you can give it to start with in certain colors and not in others, and how over or underexposed and where it will blow things out, and whether or not you want that. And all of those things are quite, you still have to get it right in camera. It's just that the right in camera, when you look at it on the screen, looks too dark, a bit flat, and slightly undercolored. And then it goes through the things. It's like, oh my God, look, it's suddenly bright blue instead of sort of gray. So and it's the same thing. It's what you're feeding in. Timothy Allen, great friend of mine and great photographer on The Independent, and then in his own right sort of did all the photography for The Human Planet and a whole bunch of other very, very, very interesting, beautiful photography. And one of the things that I remember learning from him very early on was how he would take these pictures, and I would say, well, what is that even? And he would show it to me on the back of the camera, and I would go, I don't see it. And he was shooting for how he knew it was going to be once he post-processed it. And that was not because he was going to do anything particularly clever to it, but he had shot it in a way that was compressed in its dynamic range that he was then going to open up afterwards. And he knew where those breaks were going to be and what those breaks were going to do to the composition and balance of the image. And so he was already, even in the early stages of digital camera, shooting for post-processing, even though the post-processing that we were doing and were allowed to do was actually fairly light. But he was already leveraging the unseen in the analog moment to create what he knew. And by the way, anybody that disagrees with that, don't ever shoot a black and white picture, because we don't see in black and white.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean,
that whole process is exactly the same. It's just we fetishize craftsmanship over art, which is, I think, a mistake. I think what you mean to do with it is the important thing, not whether or not the physical demands and intellectual demands and thought process and control of that is, I think, a lot less interesting than the outcome. Photographers talk about images. They don't often talk about the techniques of those images, because the techniques are just part of what you have to do to get the image, but the image is the important thing.
Yeah, and also, when I teach the process, this is how I do it. Like, there might be somebody else who does it differently. Awesome. Good luck to them. But this is how I do it, and this is how I know how to do it. And actually, this is how I like doing it. I always compare it to one of the things I use as a sort of just as a thought. So what I do just to explain as a process is I bring in an amplifier and an electric guitar, and to explain the relationship between the shooting part and the post-processing part is, I basically explain, well, if you look at an amplifier, on its own, it's just an inanimate object. A box with a speaker in it doesn't make any sound. It's dead silent. It's not exactly musical. You take the electric guitar on its own, it's a very quiet instrument. Unamplified, it sounds like nothing. It sounds very twangy, doesn't sound very good. It's not what we expect of what we think of when we think of the sound of an electric guitar. But you plug the guitar into the amplifier, and that's where the magic happens. You put these two things together, you get that beautiful music that we all recognize as awesome guitar sounds. And what I do in that type of portraiture is exactly the same. The raw image out of the camera doesn't necessarily, it's not what you expect the end product to be. The post-process, the computer itself doesn't really do very much. Again, it's just inanimate. But when you put the two together and you put it through a process, that's when the magic happens. And it's important to realize that when you create that type of portraiture, it's part of a process. Some people, shoot on film and create portraits that way. And it's once it comes out of the lab, that is it. That's the end of the process. And that's fantastic. Something I'm trying to teach myself somehow. Or I'm trying to
The choice of film stock is kind of the same thing.
Exactly. And that's why it always gets more complicated. That's what I've learned when it comes to film. It's a never-ending thing. I thought it was going to be easy, but it really isn't.
No, so it's really funny because there are these old-fashioned truisms around film, and of course, film is not the same thing because it's not produced in the same bulk and it's not produced. I understand it's all changed, and I personally shoot very, very, very little film now, other than Polaroid film, which you're not really shooting film, you're shooting prints. But anyway, but back in the day when I was shooting film and we shot tens of thousands of pounds worth of film in my business in New York every year, and we didn't ever charge clients for it because of a vagary of United States law that meant that whoever paid for the film owned the copyright, so we didn't charge a single cent for any of our film. We spent, between the business, we spent what would be a pretty decent living for somebody just on film, and we absorbed that cost. But one of the things I learned was the packaging gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. So Fuji was green and blue.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Kodak was reds and yellows. It was... Yeah. And you picked your film. You didn't, you had films that you loved and that expressed the way you like to see things. So on portraiture, I was a big fan of Kodak film over Fuji. But then on certain things, beautiful landscapes. So I was a big fan of Fuji over Kodak, unless, of course, you wanted that cinematic Americana. I was living in America at the time, and then, of course, you'd be sort of back to maybe the Kodak stocks because of their golden, their great way they sang in golden light. They really came alive. All of these are really legitimate creative processes in what you're deciding to do. And exactly. I hate anybody that fetishizes one thing over another, because a really good, I think a good creator and a good professional photographer should use what is appropriate for the best chance of getting the outcome of what they have decided they would like to say. We shouldn't very often be just turning up with no clue. Although I'm also sort of a fan of that as well. When I was in college, we had a great tutor who said, "So great photographs are made in one of three ways. You knew exactly what it was you wanted to capture. You prepared. You had everything ready in your own mind. You had the skill. You executed perfectly on that, or you executed excellently, shall we say, on that, and you got the image that you were sort of wanting to get, both in terms of color and expression and exposure and all that sort of stuff. The picture was great. Then there's those photographs where you had an idea of what you wanted, and then something else happened, but because you'd made preparations and you got yourself ready, you were ready to take advantage of the fact that something had changed, and you were prepared to follow that change in narrative, and you had the mental flexibility to do so as well, and that rendered a great picture. There wasn't at all what you intended, but you had made the preparations that meant it was possible to capture that. And he said, and then there's sometimes you're completely unprepared, you fall over, you accidentally take a picture, and it's great. And he said, like, by a show of hands, what's the best of these three? And by far the majority of the class put their hands up for A or B. And he just said, they're all the same. There's literally no difference. A successful image is a successful image, no matter how it's derived, no matter the process to it. what you're really talking about is whether or not you can build a business on it. You can't really build a business as a professional photographer on I accidentally do stuff until the accidents happen regularly enough that you can. But most people are going to have to build the process on I have skills which are repeatable within a range and are divergent, but basically I know how it's going to be when I turn up, and I know how it's going to be, and it's going to involve a certain process, and I know what that process is, and I know what the outcome is going to be. That's the basis by which you can be a professional photographer. And the difference between professional and amateur is, I think, in my opinion, has got nothing to do with images and everything to do with just earning money from it. You either a professional photographer is just one that earns money from their imagery as a source of income. One of arguably the best documentary photojournalists, long-form storytellers in Britain, is this insanely talented photographer called Jim Mortram. And he's not a professional photographer. He doesn't earn his living from photography, even though the caliber and strength of his images is far in advance of 95% of people practicing photography for a living. But his process isn't that. He has another process, and his process does not lend itself to being told to go to point A and cover subject B. That's not his process. So the idea that professional photography is innately better than amateur photography is not one that I buy into on any level. I just think that, I know a bunch of professional photographers who are very, very, very good practitioners of certain parametric things, and that's how they've built their business. Their own personal work might be incredibly exciting and their professional work might not be. Sometimes neither work is particularly exciting, but they earn very, very, very good, solid livings from what they do. And then I know amateur photographers who produce incredible imagery that genuinely blows my mind. And I don't mean from a technical point of view, I mean in terms of its emotional impact and its weight and its atmosphere. And the truth is that the only way they are ever going to work as a professional photographer is if they can find a constituency of people that are going to pay for the prints that they make, because there's nothing in their process that fits with what people will want to commission a photographer to do. And so professional photography for me is not it's not a statement of quality. It's just a statement of the way that you earn your living, really.
Yeah, in the truest sense of the word. Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast today. And I just mention it again. Objects are people too. Here's the book. Make sure you check it out. If you are listening to the audio version of this podcast, remember, head over to YouTube where you can see, well, not only me holding up the book, but also you can see lots of the photographs that are present in the book as we're flying them in throughout the show. So, Justin, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today.
Kirsten, thank you so much for having me. It's been just fantastic and so enjoyable to hear your story.
Okay, folks, that's it for today. It was amazing having Justin on the show. And remember, check out the book, Objects Are People Too. And as always, before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you like. Check out episode 203 with Pablo Giori, where we discuss experimental photography. Super awesome. I'm sure you love it. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us continue creating and bringing you more exciting episodes. It really does mean the world to us. And for those of you who are listening to the audio version of this podcast, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version over on YouTube with plenty of examples of our guest photography in full Technicolor? Well, you should by now because I mention it all the time. All you have to do is go over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll be able to watch all past episodes on there. And if you're already on YouTube, well, just drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring that bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach a wider audience all over the world. So thank you for listening and watching. And remember, a new episode drops every Thursday, so make sure you mark that in your calendars. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.